Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey of My Mother's Son podcast. Now, I'm joined with best-selling author Larry Schechter. Larry, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the conversation, but before we get started, just introduce yourself in your own words. Who is Larry today?
Well, I have played fantasy sports for about 30 years, fantasy baseball and fantasy football, and I've been known as one of the better fantasy baseball players. I wrote a book in 2014 called Winning Fantasy Baseball, which was all about my fantasy baseball strategy. And I just, about 6 months ago, released a new book called The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen, which is not about me. It's about, as it says, the history of fantasy sports. And this is all stuff that I've done on the side. I've never been involved in fantasy sports or writing as a profession.
Yeah, I love it. So how did you get involved in fantasy sports initially?
Initially, about 1992, roughly, I was driving around Boston where I lived one day, and I heard an ad on the radio for something that sounded very interesting. And it turned out to be a company that was actually an individual was running a company offering fantasy baseball leagues. And I joined. They did the draft by a conference call, and I immediately liked it. And a couple of years later, he went out of business, so I had to look in the USA Today and the Sporting News to find someone else that offered uh, fantasy games. I joined another company, and I've been playing fantasy baseball and fantasy football ever since.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was really in the early days of fantasy sports for sure. I mean, when was what was really the advent? Like, when did fantasy sports start? I'm not a huge fantasy sports guy. I was in a fantasy football league for 2 years, but I was so bad that I would forget to change my lineup. And most weekends, I would have three guys that were in my lineup who had buys that week. So I just
Right.
didn't have the focus to stay on it myself. So, when did it really kind of come about? And, I'm sure we'll get into it as we talk more. So,
Yeah.
I just want to love to hear the evolution of how it's changed from its inception to, where it's at today. But, when did it really kind of start would be the first question here.
All right. Well, it kind of starts with precursors to fantasy sports. There were like tabletop games going back to the 1800s where, I mean, just like primitive things where like you'd slide a penny with your finger and it would slide into a spring activated bat that would hit the penny on this board, and it would fall into a hole that would say out or single or home run or whatever. And then you got to board games like there's Catico Ellis All Star Baseball, and then games like Appa and Stratomatic. Appa and Stratomatic were based on the actual performance of Major League Baseball players or NFL players. But the distinction is the actual performance for prior seasons. What I call modern fantasy sports are the games that are based on things that have not happened yet. So, like if you draft a fantasy football team in August and then the season starts in September, and when you draft your team, you don't know what's going to happen. You're picking players based on what you would expect would happen, but you don't know what's going to happen until the season starts. So, what I call modern fantasy sports are games based on events that haven't happened yet. The first fantasy football league started in 1963.
Wow.
Yeah, and the first like what is kind of commonly known as the first fantasy baseball league was in 1980, but there were people playing kind of primitive fantasy baseball games before that. Among just it's just nothing that ever spread.
Yeah. Yeah. I had no idea the fantasy football started in the 60s. That's very interesting for sure.
Yeah, and the
Uh,
guy who started that in '63 actually before that he had kind of like a primitive fantasy golf game and a primitive fantasy baseball game in the late '50s. And he told somebody about that in like '62, and they're like, "We should do this for football."
yeah. It's pretty wild. So what was it about fantasy sports that attracted you back in '93 when you first got involved?
Well, Yeah, I think probably the same thing that attracts a lot of people is I like sports, at least, football, baseball for sure. So I watched it anyway, and it makes the game better. Lets you control things. It's a competitive thing. It's just fun. Fantasy sports are just fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, now from 93, what are some of the, biggest changes you've seen in, I mean, really what's a boom of fantasy sports nowadays? I mean, I'm definitely in the minority of sports fans who, is a sports fan who probably doesn't play fantasy sports. So, because really everybody, all my friends have their own fantasy teams. My nephew is in a fantasy football league, and so I'm definitely in the minority, I think, when it comes to it. So, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, talk about some of those changes, how it's evolved over the years.
Well, when they started, first of all, I mean, there's several things. First of all, there's a complete lack of information. When it first started, um, you couldn't go on the internet and get all the information available. So, like for example, one of the first fantasy football leagues that started in Florida, perhaps the first in Florida, one of the guys subscribed to all 28 NFL city out of town newspapers. So he'd get the newspaper and he would get information about their local NFL team that you couldn't get anywhere else. There was no internet
Right.
unless you looked at the paper. So he would have a big advantage on his competitors that didn't do this. Um, and also back then, the way that the players in a league would have to call the commissioner every week and tell him their moves that they wanted to make. The commissioner would have to enter it in by hand, do all the statistics by hand, get them out of the newspaper or the Sporting News or USA Today, and do all the statistics and calculate all the standings by hand. So it was very time consuming. And then when computers came along, that allowed people to do this by computer, made it a lot easier. And then when the internet came along, fantasy really exploded because it made it so easy to play and so easy for people to find out what about leagues and join leagues and make their own moves. And you had, back a while ago, you would have to wait and get your reports in the mail. So like if your fantasy, if the football happened on Sunday and Monday night, you wouldn't get your report until probably like Friday or something in the mail. And then fax machines came along, so some people would get it by fax, they could get it sooner. And then the internet, you could get it online. And when the internet started, it's like you could get standings like a day later, and then technology improved. You could get the actual live updated standings every hour, and then it's like every 5 minutes, and then it's like immediately. Where now something happens on the field, and your fantasy league standings are updated within like 3 seconds.
Yeah. Pretty amazing the way, technology has changed everything for sure. But fantasy sports has certainly been one of the things it's affected quite a bit.
Yeah.
Um, so, you said this isn't anything you've ever done, you know, professionally. This has been something you've done on the side, but you've been very successful at it as well. So, you know, how did you kind of juggle your regular life? I mean, because it can be very time consuming you know, to
Yeah.
be successful at it. So, how did that kind of balancing act work for you?
Well, yeah, it is very time consuming. It has been my main hobby, so I spend a lot of time on it. And, I mean, I could be doing other things, but it's been my main hobby. And yeah, it's very time consuming. I mean, some people spend hours and hours on it. Some people are like what you did, like, you don't spend much time and you forget to even make moves. Um, yeah, so it's different.
So, what made you want to write a book about it when you published your first book back over 10 years ago now?
Well, so I was regarded as one of the best fantasy baseball players in the world. I'm in two of the well-known fantasy baseball experts leagues. One's called Tout Wars, the other is Labor, which is sponsored by the USA Today. And I don't even remember what I was thinking back then, but I just decided, I'm going to just write a book and tell people all my strategy, tell people how to play. It's good for people who've never played before, it tells them exactly what to do from beginning to end, or people who are experienced players, it gives them a lot of good strategy advice. And after I wrote that book, I would sometimes ask myself if I had any ideas for any other book. And the only idea I ever had that was any good is the book that I just put out, because I would look around at the industry and you had people had ideas for games years ago. And now, years later, what you have millions and millions of people playing fantasy sports all over the world, everything from fantasy football and fantasy baseball to fantasy wakeboarding, cricket, uh, fantasy Iditarod, fantasy everything. And you've got news services and stat services and a Sirius XM radio channel dedicated 24/7 to fantasy sports. You watch a football game or baseball game, you got fantasy statistics. I mean, it's just this phenomenon. It's like really a cultural phenomenon. And nobody has ever written a book like this. Nobody has ever explained how did this all happen. You can get little bits and pieces of it if you research something, but there's nothing even close to a comprehensive explanation. So I've known for a long time a book like this was needed, and I decided a couple of years ago to do it. And my idea was I'm going to write. The book is going to be called The History of Fantasy Sports, and I'm going to tell who did what when. And I had no idea. Most people had no idea. So I started, did massive research. I interviewed dozens and dozens of people. And what happened early on is I started to hear fascinating stories about what people did. Um, some of them were inspirational. Some of them would bring a tear to your eye. Lots of stuff was funny. And so I realized early on I could write the history of fantasy sports, who did what when, and it would get the job done, but it would also come off as a very boring research paper. But by telling the stories of what people did, it's made the book fascinating and easy to read. And, I'm not just saying this is what the reviews are saying. The reviews are fantastic. People who've never played fantasy sports love it because it's really not, it's not about how fantasy sports works or strategy or that sort of thing. It's about the stories of these people. To give you an example, I mentioned before when computers came around, people realized they could use statistics on computers to make it a lot easier. So one of the first statistic companies was run by a couple named Jim and Gloria Berger from Pennsylvania. And what they had to do then for baseball was you get the USA Today on Tuesday, had the American League statistics, and on Wednesday had the National League statistics. So Gloria would read the statistics to Jim. He'd enter them in the computer, and Wednesday they would have the computer calculate all the standings, and they'd get the reports into the mail to their clients on Wednesday night. So that's kind of the who, what, when.
Right.
Now the interesting story about them is one Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with her first child, and they did not let a little thing like going into labor stop them. So in between contractions, Gloria would read Jim the statistics. And then she'd say, "Oh, wait, hold on, here comes another one. Okay, it passed." And she continued. And they got the report uh, in the mail Wednesday night on time to their clients. And their first child, a daughter, was born that day. And now, 37 years later, the daughter plays in a fantasy football league with her dad.
That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah.
So as a regular sports fan, have you found that you view sports differently now that that you're so involved in fantasy sports? I mean, I always found like um one of the things that I would struggle with when I was in the fantasy league was kind of like rooting against my own team at times because I had a player on my fantasy team who was playing against them and I wanted him to do good, but you had that kind of clash of you still wanting your team to win. So, how did
Yeah.
you cope with that?
Well, before I answer the question about me, you just reminded me of a couple of stories in the book. First of all, going back to that first fantasy football league in 1963, I didn't mention the guy who started that, his name Bill Winkenbach. He was a 10% owner of the Oakland Raiders.
Oh,
And
wow.
the people in his initial league were mostly involved with the Raiders or like Oakland, San Francisco sports writers. And going back to that first season in 63, these guys would be sitting at the Raiders games, and they could have a player on the other team that's on their fantasy team. And so they're sitting there, like in the Oakland Stadium, whatever it was called back then, and they're rooting for a player who's playing against the Raiders. And the people, other people sitting around them are like, "What the hell are you doing?"
Right.
And there's another one, one of an early baseball league where these guys, I think it was the stories in the book. I don't remember. I think it was Philadelphia. Maybe they were at Phillies games, and like they would have a couple players on. Like each of them might have a couple players on the Phillies, and they had a couple players on the Phillies' opponent. So like 1 second it seems like they're rooting for the Phillies, and then the next minute it seems like they're rooting for the other team. And the guy sitting next to them was like, again, what the hell are you doing? So they explained it their fantasy baseball to this guy, and the next game, I guess they were one of them was a season ticket holder. The next game, he brought the rules and he gave it to this other guy, and the other guy ended up starting his own league. And
Man.
for me personally, it's like um, playing fantasy. There are times when I might be rooting against my favorite team, at least partially for something, depending on how important the fantasy thing is compared to how important it is for the team I like. Um, at the same time, though, it's always made me a lot more aware of all the other teams and players, and I watch a lot more games. And this is typical. The the professional leagues, NFL, Major League Baseball, etc., NBA, and the players' associations initially were very down on fantasy. They thought it wasn't good. And it took them a while to come around and realize fantasy was actually great for them. It's like the fantasy players are watching like 3 times as much of games a week. They're buying the TV packages, they're buying more merchandise. It took them a while to realize fantasy was actually a good thing for them.
Right.
And in my book, my book goes through the whole history, starting with the precursors, then the invention and spread of fantasy football, the invention and spread of fantasy baseball, the first commercial games, the first publications, the first stat services, news services, legal issues, that what I just mentioned about the players, the leagues and players associations being resistant, how they finally came around. The whole history, then through more modern things like daily fantasy sports and worldwide expansion.
Right. So how do you go about, you know, building your team in the beginning to be successful?
Well, the first thing, is know the rules and scoring system of your league so that when you're looking at players, you can try to accurately or as best you can project what their value is going to be based on your scoring system. Because sometimes you could have the same player in baseball or football or whatever, and in one scoring system, they're going to be more valuable than in a different scoring system. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, the amount of work that you put in will help. Which, but it's about having fun too. So like, it's not like you have to put in a lot of work. If somebody wants to just do it casually to have fun, that's fine. If they want to take their favorite players, that's fine. And other people want to be really competitive and put in a lot of work and try to figure it all out. That's it's whatever works.
Gotcha.
Sometimes men have been so involved in fantasy that their wife or girlfriend is not happy about it. But that can happen with anything, though. Even you could be playing golf or something, and have the same problem with your wife or girlfriend. That there was one thing I learned in researching the book is a woman named Alison Lodish put together a group of women, a group of women who are kind of aggravated by their husbands and boyfriends. It was called Women Against Fantasy Sports. And they would tell stories, like commiserate with each other about how their, husband or boyfriend would ignore them because of their fantasy sports. And Allison, for a while, sold merchandise on Facebook and a website. One of them was I mean, she sold a few different things, but like the most popular one was a T-shirt that said, "I thought I was your fantasy." And the most popular seller was a women's underwear that said "closed for this fantasy season."
That's funny. And
Yeah,
she kind of took a situation that she didn't like and kind of turned it to her into her advantage a little bit. That's excellent. That's entrepreneurship at its finest right there.
yeah, yeah. So that's actually the common thread of everybody that I write about in the book. For the most part, they're entrepreneurs, and they created something because it didn't exist, or it existed but they thought they could do better. It's like fantasy sports started, and like for example, there's a guy named Ian Allen and Bruce Taylor that when they were friends in college at the University of Washington, they got into a fantasy football league and they loved it immediately. And then the next year, Bruce was given an assignment in college to create a plan for something, some kind of product or service or whatever, just kind of create a plan and how you would approach it. And you weren't supposed to actually do anything. It was just a college project, but it's kind of like, make a plan. So Ian and Bruce said like, well, this fantasy football thing is great, but there's no information available. So how about a magazine? That'd be a great idea, fantasy football magazine. So Bruce did this as a college project, and then they decided let's do it for real, and they did it for real. And now, 30 years or whatever later, it's Fantasy Football Index is then it's still one of the largest fantasy football magazines in existence. It's been one of the biggest for years.
Wow.
So, it's like people would see, like I said, like first computer people would say like, oh, we could do this for fantasy sports, and they create a statistics service, and then people would say, we should have a news service, like give like updates on the players on a regular basis. And so all these entrepreneurs just saw a need for something.
Yeah, I love that. So when you published your first book, did you have any aspirations or, any vision of it becoming the bestseller that it did and, just the way it was embraced after you published it?
I thought it would do well because I had a good reputation and a lot of people are interested in the subject. And for my current book, I expect it to do a whole lot better, in terms of the people that read it, because my first one was first kind of a specific audience, people who play fantasy baseball and they're interested in the strategy. And the strategy, a lot of it does apply to other sports, but not entirely. Um, Whereas this book here, I mean, this book it about the history of fantasy sports. It's great for anybody who plays any fantasy sport, fantasy football, basketball, whatever. And as I've said, even a lot of people who've never played fantasy sports love it. The Midwest Book Review said fascinating from start to finish, and that was by a man who's never played fantasy sports.
Yeah, yeah. And you'd mentioned about, fantasy leagues for cricket and the Iditarod and, stuff like that, which is really fascinating to me to know that there's, it's that broad. But when you were doing your own research for the book, were there any sports that you came across that kind of blew you away that you didn't know there was a fantasy league for them?
I mean, several. I mean, Iditarod for one. I mean, now not everybody knows offhand what Iditarod is. So for anybody who doesn't know, it's the Alaskan the Alaskan snow sledding competition where they have a bunch of dogs pulling sleds over what is like a 2 week period or something.
Right.
Yeah, and and there's wakeboarding and there's fantasy bass fishing,
Wow.
uh, sumo wrestling. I mean, I have a list in the book where I say, okay, this is a list of the fantasy sports that I've discovered over the course of, researching this book. And I say that the list is probably not all inclusive. There's undoubtedly more that I didn't get, but the list is over 50 different sports.
Wow.
And something that blew my mind is that, well, there's a statistic that I've known that 50 million people, adults, play fantasy sports in the US. So that doesn't count under age 18. There's a lot of under age 18 that play fantasy sports.
Right.
All right. So I knew that 50 million US play fantasy sports. What I didn't know, most people don't know, in India, the biggest fantasy cricket company has 200 million people playing fantasy cricket.
Wow. That's a lot of people
That's a lot of people. I mean, that's four times more that play fantasy sports in the US.
in the US. That's
Yeah.
that's incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. Man. How long did it take you to write this most recent book? I mean, with all the research, and like you said, a lot of it is probably not all inclusive because there's probably a lot out there that you didn't end up coming across, which is
Yeah.
really even more mind blowing when you have a list of 50 sports.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I was very naive. I thought it was something I could knock out in 3 or 4 months. And I was completely wrong. It took 18 months of full-time work.
Wow, wow, amazing. But out of the gate, looks like it's been very successful so far, and we'll probably just continue that trajectory on its as it continues to gain momentum, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Um, so, Larry, is there anything that we missed that you think would be important to the listeners before we start to wrap things up?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, I just think that, I gave a couple of stories. Um, there's just like so many stories in the book that are like I've said, interesting, funny, fascinating. I'll just give you one of the I mentioned a few, make you want to cry. I'll just give you one of those. Um, one of the one of the precursors I mentioned, App and Stratomatic were games that were precursors to fantasy sports. Um, and there's an APA league that's been around for 40, 50 years. These kids started in college. And one of the guys in 2018, Randy Walker, developed ALS. And everybody thought he's going to have to stop playing in their APA league. But his wife said, if you want to keep playing, I'll do whatever I have to do so you can keep playing. And she went to the games with him and she'd roll the dice for him. And then he would tell her what moves to make. And she did this. And the third year that she was doing this, he got to the point where he could only communicate through an eye reader and a computer, and she could read his lips. And in that condition, Randy's team came from 2 runs behind in extra innings to win his first ever APA World Series championship after 39 years in the league.
Wow, that is pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah.
That is pretty
And
cool.
it is, yeah. And there's a couple of other really cool stories like that. Um, and as I was starting that story, I realized there is actually one really big thing that I have not mentioned. And this is something that I discovered as I was researching and writing. It just started to become really apparent is one of the big themes in the book, which I had no idea, is fantasy sports brings people together. It's a
Yeah,
cultural phenomenon. You got coworkers playing, you got parents and children. Um, you got a fantasy football draft in Las Vegas where you have a plumber sitting next to the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and they're talking like they're best buddies. Um, and the Randy Walker story. It's like you got people in high school or college started like a app or Stratomatic or fantasy league, and they've stayed together for 30, 40, 50 years, whereas otherwise
that's
they might have drifted apart.
that's pretty cool. Yeah, and actually the league I was in was actually a lot of friends from high school, And I mean, we still get together when we get back to Pennsylvania, and they're still in that league, and I'm not, but it's definitely one of the things that, keeps those guys together and connected on a
Yeah,
regular basis as well. So yeah, it is kind of a phenomenon for sure that it brings people together and creates lasting, friendships, which is pretty neat. So Larry, if anybody's out there interested in grabbing the book or, reaching out to you, how can they find out more about what you're doing?
well, the book is available on most booksellers' websites, paperback and ebook. Amazon has all the reviews. I mean, if you want to, Amazon's probably the easiest place to buy it. But also, if you want to see more of what's in the book and read a lot of reviews, Amazon's where you're going to find most of that.
Okay.
It's
Yeah, and
called The
I'll put
History of
a
Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People that Made It Happen.
excellent. I'll put a link in the show notes so people just click on it and go right to both your books actually, that they can go right to them and check them out more, for sure. So Larry, that brings us to our final question. As you know, the subtitle of the podcast is "Many Little People in Many Little Places," which comes from the opening lyrics of the Michael Franti song "Gloria," which go, "When many little people in many little places do many little things, and the whole world changes." So it's one of the little things that Larry does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place.
Uh, Try to make people laugh. I'm a comedian at heart.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would say that. I'll go with that.
I love that, and that's important, man. Laughter, they say laughter is the best medicine, and that is truly a fact. You can be having a horrible day and find something to laugh about, and it just changes everything for you for sure. So I love that. It's a great little thing to do for sure. Larry, it's a great conversation. The book sounds fascinating. I'm sure some of my listeners are going to go out and track it down and check it out. So I appreciate you taking the time. For everybody out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com. Or there, pick up a copy of one of my books. Also, check out my Pay It Forward program, where you can buy a copy of one of my books, and Sandy and I will donate it to somebody along our travels. And again, Larry, it's a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk to me today.
All right. Thanks a lot for having me.
You bet.